still have time.
It's rare when an actor becomes so involved in a role and plays it so well that you just can't imagine anybody else ever playing that role. And Hugh Jackman did this for the character of Wolverine. And Logan is the final goodbye to fans. Before we get into the review, I do want you to know there will be spoilers. We're going to talk about everything. Where Logan fits in the timeline, Easter eggs, we're going to compare it to the Old Man Logan story, what I liked, what I didn't like, just everything. Let's start by talking about where Logan fits in the X-Men timeline. Now, there has been some confusion about this because Hugh Jackman did state that Logan does take place in an alternate timeline by itself, not having anything to do with the previous movies. Later, the director corrected the statement and made it clear that yes, these do take place in the X-Men timeline after all the other movies. After watching Logan, it does fit in the X-Men timeline rather nicely, without many problems. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the X-Men timeline because it's a huge explanation involving time travel, which I already made a video on going into that entire thing. So I'll link it right here above. So if you want to go check that out first, you're more than welcome to. The basic idea is that Wolverine traveled back in time to the 1970s to stop the events that led to a dark future where the world was devastated by mutant hunting robots called the Sentinels. Now by doing this, the entire timeline changed, wiping out the events of the previous X-Men movies and creating a brand new timeline. Wolverine wakes up in 2023 in the new timeline, and the dark future of the Sentinels never happened. Logan takes place in this same timeline 6 years later, in 2029. But that does create some questions. How did Logan become so old and in such poor physical condition in that short time? And where did all the mutants go? If you pay attention to the details while watching Logan, it does provide pretty solid explanations for these questions. And this is where it gets kind of depressing. In this timeline, there were no Sentinels hunting down mutants to extinction, but there was a scientist called Dr. Rice that secretly created a formula that suppresses mutant genes. It was mass-produced and put into corn syrup, which is found in a ton of different food products. So over time, this started causing less and less mutants to be born, to the point where mutants are almost extinct. About a year before Logan takes place, in 2028, an aging Professor X, starting to lose control of his psychic powers, suffers a seizure, and with this, unintentionally causes the death of most of the X-Men. Wolverine was one of the only survivors and became Professor X's caretaker and moved out west with him in the middle of nowhere. By 2029, Wolverine is 197 years old, and his healing factor has slowed down, causing the adamantium in his body to slowly start poisoning him, making him sick. So we've established that the movie makes sense from an X-Men timeline point of view. But like I said before, it's kind of depressing. The X-Men traveled back in time to stop a dark future where mutants were hunted down to extinction and the X-Men were no more, only to end up in a timeline that still found a way to drive mutants to almost extinction, and one in which the X-Men were also destroyed. It's almost as if the timeline was trying to correct itself. Time travel movies have always played with the idea that time will always find a way to make things happen that it wants to happen. Just a quick example in Terminator 2. Sarah Connor and John Connor stopped Judgment Day, or so they thought. Terminator 3 came along, and the end of the world still happened, just later on and in a different way. Time still found a way to make it happen. Logan is one of the best comic book movies I've ever seen. And it doesn't necessarily feel like a comic book movie either. You know, there's no huge final battle with superheroes flying around in costumes fighting a supervillain that's about to destroy the world. It's a very personal story on a smaller scale. Very loosely based on the Old Man Logan story. Now in that comic, we see an old Logan on a cross-country road trip with a blind Hawkeye. And there's all kinds of craziness in this thing. Red Skull is the president of the United States, supervillains rule parts of the country, there's a Venom T-Rex, a gang of hillbilly Hulks. It's a crazy story, and none of that is in the movie. But the movie does borrow the concept of an aging Wolverine and the road trip factor. He lives out in the middle of nowhere with Professor X and Caliban, who appeared in X-Men Apocalypse. Now, why he had a heavy European accent then, and a British one now, I do not know.
Psylocke gets a little jealous. Caliban likes you so much, he wants to give you free information about an old friend. From back when you had friends.
And Professor X regularly suffers from the same seizures that killed the X-Men, and he has to keep taking this medicine to suppress them from happening. And he starts communicating mentally with a little girl that makes her way over to them. This little girl is X-23, a clone of Wolverine that was introduced in the X-Men Evolution animated series. And she became so popular that Marvel ended up inserting her into the comic book universe. And she's finally made her way into the movies. And this was actually set up, too, in the end credits scene of X-Men Apocalypse. Wolverine had just escaped the Weapon X program, and a company called SX Corporation took one of his blood samples. At some point, his DNA ended up in the hands of another company called the Alkali Transigen Corporation, and they created X-23 using that DNA. They also created a group of mutant kids using DNA from other mutants, and some of the kids escaped. X-23 wants Logan to help her meet the other kids and go to a safe haven they call Eden, while a group of cybernetically enhanced mercenaries called the Reavers are trying to track them down. The more I talk about this movie, the more I want to watch it again. There are so many things that I loved about it, and so few things that I didn't like. Everybody has outstanding performances. The relationship between Logan and Professor X is completely genuine. It feels like a son taking care of his elderly father, and you can see how much these two characters really care about each other. Caliban acts like the naggy housewife that's constantly asking Wolverine to talk about his feelings. And when X-23 comes into the picture, she's the out-of-control child that Logan is struggling to keep under control. Out of all the X-Men movies, this is the one with the most heart. I can't think of a character more tragic than Wolverine. And this movie represents that aspect of the character perfectly. There's a point where he's just so affected by everything that's happening that he breaks down crying. You can just see all the years of tragedy just swelling up inside of him. Hugh Jackman absolutely deserves an award for his performance in Logan. And the action scenes are intense. When Wolverine lets loose, he shreds people apart with his claws, and it's graphic, as it should be. I hate when movies force an R rating just to be edgy. But with Logan, this makes perfect sense. Wolverine, by his very nature, is a violent character, and an R rating was the best way to go. I also really liked how in this world the X-Men were well-known superheroes. So much so that they have their own fictional comic books that were written about them. And there's a kid in one part that's holding a Wolverine doll. There is an X-24 in the movie, a direct clone of Wolverine. It just looks like a young Hugh Jackman. It's a carbon copy of Wolverine. He's the major final villain of the movie. I thought this was a little lazy. The clone has no personality, no backstory. It's just a clone. I feel like pulling from the comic books, they had so much more material that they could have used before resorting to just making evil Wolverine the bad guy. Why not bring back Sabretooth? This was the final time, as of now, that we're seeing Wolverine on the big screen. And having him face his nemesis for the final time could have been a huge, epic confrontation. One of the few good things about X-Men Origins was the relationship that Wolverine and Sabretooth had in that movie. It was done perfectly. But none of the other X-Men movies ever really touched upon that at all. In X-Men 1, Sabretooth acts like he's never seen Wolverine. Logan completely missed the opportunity to bring back Sabretooth and give us a closing to that relationship.
We're done.
We could never be done, Jimmy. We're brothers, and brothers look out for each other.
There's a couple of really cool Easter eggs I noticed, too. One of these kids that were cloned has these really cool seismic wave earthquake powers, and they flash his file on the screen in one part, and if you read through it real quick, you notice that he was cloned from the DNA of a mutant called Dominic Petros. Now, if you follow comic books, you know that Dominic Petros is also known as Avalanche. And this kid that was cloned from his DNA was called Richter, who in the comics was part of the X-Force comic books. Now, his origin is completely different than the comics, but he is in there. And there's a couple of timeline things I found interesting too. Wolverine carries an adamantium bullet with him, which is something we saw in X-Men Origins Wolverine. We also see a katana in the background in one part, implying that he went on a trip to Japan, like in The Wolverine. And Professor X also mentions that when he found Wolverine, he was just a cage fighter. And Wolverine also mentions the incident at the Statue of Liberty. These are both right out of X-Men 1. Now here's the problem with that. All of those events were from movies that were wiped out as part of the old timeline. But maybe it does make sense. I see this as meaning that these previous events that were wiped out still happened, but maybe in a different way that we haven't seen in the movies yet. Again, time correcting itself. In fact, the only details we've seen in the movies of this Wolverine's past is him getting taken by Weapon X in the 1970s and the X-Men helping him escape Weapon X in the 1980s. Then waking up in 2023 after time changed. So between the 1980s and 2023, we really don't know the details of Wolverine's life in the new timeline. We still have plenty of stories to tell in the X-Men universe to fill in this new timeline. But after 2029, there's no more X-Men. It's already been confirmed that the X-Men universe is going to continue past Professor X and Magneto. And X-23 is going to star in future films. Maybe even a grown-up version, alongside Richter as part of X-Force. Logan is one of those comic book movies that goes beyond the spectacle of a superhero popcorn flick. Patrick Stewart and Hugh Jackman deserve a heartfelt thank you for bringing one of my favorite comic book universes to the big screen, and they are definitely going to be missed. But I hope you guys enjoyed my review, and I'd love to hear your opinions down below, so don't forget to leave me a comment. Remember to like, subscribe, and sign up for notifications if you haven't done so already. And make sure you check out my social media links. This is Fabian, I love you guys, and I'll see you next time.